Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, APIs Making Government as a Platform a Reality. My name's Claire Cox, and I work for the technology consultancy Scott Logic. We specialise in delivering bespoke software solutions for our clients, many of whom are in the public sector. Now, I'm delighted to be joined this morning by one of my colleagues, Graham Odds, Innovation Director at Scott Logic. And if any of you managed to attend Digital Leaders Week towards the end of last year, you might have seen Graham's presentation talking about talking about the often tapped business potential of APIs. And that was part of a week-long series of events that we ran looking at APIs and the transformative power that they could have at your organization. So if you missed any of those, you can either check them out on the Scott Logic YouTube channel or head to the website scottlogic.com/APIs, where you'll be able to watch all of those again. So if you'd like to ask Graham a question, just pop them into the question box as we go along, and we'll take as many as we can at the end. And at the end, we're going to ask you to fill in a very quick survey too, but I'll give you a bit more information about that a bit later on. So without any further ado, let me pass you over to Graham.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, everyone. I was going to start by doing a little intro of myself and Scott Logic, but Claire's done that already, so I can jump straight in. So I guess talking about myself, which is where I want to start, this is almost my disclaimer for the entire talk here is I'm not speaking to you as someone who has spent many years in public sector, doing public sector work. I'm speaking as someone who spent 15 years working in technology across all sorts of domains, all sorts of complex regulated domains, but not that much public sector. So these are kind of the views of a citizen, someone who's an outsider, and therefore maybe they're a little bit of a provocation to those of you who are deeply embedded here, and you can probably correct where I go wrong on this, but hopefully there'll still be something of real value in here, because public sector is a space in an area that I'm very passionate about in my personal life, and it's also something where Scott Logic as an organization has a lot of experience, even if I personally don't. So we said this was going to be about GaaP in the title, or government as a platform, as hopefully we all know that's what that stands for. But I wanted to just spin back slightly to where this term comes from, at least to my knowledge anyway. So Tim O'Reilly coined this in a paper he wrote back in 2010, 2011, depending on the sources you read. And you know, in this paper, he set out kind of a slightly different perspective on government, a different way of doing it, and it was sort of informed by the societal changes and the technical advances that have happened over the last couple of decades. And I want to read just a passage from that to set the scene for what we're going to do here. So he set out that government is a mechanism for collective action. He talks about how we band together, make laws, pay taxes, and build the institutions of government to manage problems that are too large for us individually and whose solution is in our common interest. In this model, government is a convener and an enabler rather than the first mover of civic action. This is a radical departure from the existing model of government, which Donald Kettle so aptly named vending machine government. We pay taxes, we expect services, and when we don't get what we expect, our participation is limited to protest. Essentially, all we can do is shake the vending machine. Collective action has been watered down to collective complaint. What if instead of a vending machine, we thought of government as the manager of a marketplace? In the vending machine model, the full menu of available services is determined beforehand. A small number of vendors have the ability to get their products into the machine, and as a result, the choices are limited and the prices are high. A bazaar, by contrast, is a place where the community itself exchanges goods and services. Now, that's straight from his paper, but this is the model, this mindset is the one that sort of strikes me as the only way we can foster innovation, but it's also the only way where really we can scale to the extent that we need to now, right? The needs of our citizens and our services are ever increasing, but they're also getting more and more complicated. And the demand, the speed, the necessity we need to move at is just always growing. but our resources are always limited. So how can we possibly meet the demands if we sit there saying, well, government and public sector is going to do everything, right? We have to be this enabler. We have to get more involved and open ourselves up in that sense. And that's what I want to try and bring to life today, showing you some examples from my experience and pointing out some specific areas that I think we can push and probe at as technologists, and dodge a little bit of the politics that kicks around relating to some of these points. So I want to start with an example from my own experience here. Now, I'm sure most of you on this webinar are familiar with the digital marketplace. It's got all these different mechanisms for connecting public sector and private sector, and I'm not here to debate whether or not it's good or bad, or what its strengths are, or what its weaknesses are. That's a separate discussion. We'll just have to agree at for this that it serves a purpose. Okay, but what I actually want to focus on is this. So if you've never seen this before, this is the Power BI dashboard that Crown Commercial Services provides for anyone to see the spending data from digital marketplace. So here we can nominally see every penny exchanged between public sector and private sector suppliers through the digital marketplace. And I applaud this transparency. I think it's fantastic that we genuinely now have a pretty open government when it comes to data. And I applaud Crown Commercial Services for trying to give us this analysis dashboard. Frankly, it's a somewhat thankless task at times, but it is quite limiting, right? When you hit systems like this, I bang my head against them pretty quickly. I can't relate this information we're seeing on the screen, or when you interact with it, back into some other aspects of the digital marketplace data, and I can't, mash it up with information I have elsewhere. I have to use lots of disparate systems, and as a result, it kind of feels, as a user, like you run into this really quickly. You hit that wall and go, oh, right, well, I can't quite do what I want to do, so I almost might as well not bother at all. And that's not me getting at the Crown Commercial Services, just to be clear, right? It's just not realistic for them to provide all the possible analysis that a consumer might want of this information. They might not have access to all the data that I might want to mash up into here. But most of us hit this as a result. Now, at Scott Logic, we're a little bit more tenacious and a little bit more technical than most. And actually, I found a way around this wall in this particular case. If you know how Power BI works, you know that it makes data calls back to some kind of API behind the scene, and we reverse engineered those. Now they're pretty horrendous, but we reverse engineered them and pulled the data out. And this meant that we could start to build a tool that we wanted within Scott Logic. Now, I was using loads of the great open tooling that's provided by GDS and others to do that, and I ended up giving myself an API, a properly engineered API that was designed for me to build a system like this, rather than what was that sort of front-end system that Crown Commercial Services was providing. And this is an example of what we can do and what happens when we make a wrong assumption that I think is the one I want to call out here. It sounds so bizarre. I should explain. My background is actually as a user experience and service designer. So I'm all about the humans. And I'm saying here on this slide, set aside the humans. And the reason here is because of this technical thing, right? Especially in public sector, but I hit this with all sorts of our clients. We start from an assumption that the end consumer is a human. In the case of public sector, we start by saying, well, we want to do things for our citizens, so let's start from the citizens. But that doesn't quite work. That's not necessarily a scalable way of tackling this problem. And anyone who's worked in service design will know that you will find myriad different variations on what is wanted, what is needed by different people, even though on the tin it might seem the same. And I'd point you at other examples of large projects, large platforms that set aside humans. If we think about the internet, one of the biggest revolutions that's happened across the globe in recent times. When Tim Berners-Lee and his team were sitting there trying to figure out how do we make this internet thing work, they weren't sitting there going, well, how do we make Facebook? How do we make Twitter? How do we do something that, how do we make something that is the service that people are saying they need, right? They started with something that was a technical solution for sharing information. They set aside what people might do with it, and they just looked at, well, how might we do this? And I think this is sort of key to I guess what I'm asking around, what I think government needs to do and government bodies need to do, is to stop thinking as though you're some kind of monopolistic provider of public services, right? You have a monopolistic responsibility for certain areas of it, absolutely, and that is correct, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have to be solely responsible for providing the services in the front line. And in the private sector, this is something that's becoming increasingly commonplace, certainly. There's great examples. I've put up a screenshot from Stripe. Now, if you've never come across Stripe before, you probably still have used it, especially in this last year while we've been in lockdown. They provide payments infrastructure, quite simply, but they don't thrust themselves upon the user. There's very little of their systems that you end up seeing, despite the fact you're using it. They recognize that payments is a really complex beast. It's a complex service, and it requires a lot of expertise to do. But from the end consumer, citizen, user, whatever you want to call them, payments is just a bit in a bigger flow, right? It's sometimes the least glamorous bit. It's the bit we would wish we could skip over, right? So it doesn't impose itself. It just provides, behind the scenes, it provides these APIs that allows others to integrate into their services. And those services, those are actually the things that the consumers want to interact with. But as a result, they know that those APIs they provide are that's their be-all and end-all. That's their key point of interaction with their customers, which are not the end consumers. So those APIs, they treat them like true first-class citizens. And as a techie, trust me, if you go on the website and you look at how they expose those APIs and all the tooling they give around it, it is glorious. It is a real something to behold. And this isn't some like teensy-weensy little anomaly somewhere, just to be clear, right? This is a company that's currently valued at about $36 billion. And it is not, it's not in its true substance. It's a genuine business. This is not some VC-backed fluff, in my opinion, anyway. And this is the scalability that I think we need to be trying to aim at. This is a way, if we step back and set aside as humans, if we think as though we're an enabler rather than a controller, then actually that's how we can create real value. I mean, this is a quote recounted by, attributed to Bill Gates, but accounted by someone else. And it talks to that, right? The point is, if you want to create a platform, it's about creating more value than the person, the institution that owns that platform. Okay, but I've touched on APIs there, right? I'll do the slight disambiguation. I'm not aiming here at a hugely technical audience. So APIs, if you don't know, stands for Application Programming Interface. And this is a broad technical construct that has existed pretty much as long as digital technology has. They're defined ways of exposing information or functionality or services to some third party. Now, I find it really helpful when I talk about APIs to actually conceptually compare them to user interfaces. Both user interfaces and APIs, application programming interfaces, they dictate what you can see and do with a digital system in the broadest sense. The real difference between UIs and APIs is who they do that for, right? So user interfaces let people interact with machines. And APIs do exactly the same thing, but they let other machines, other digital systems interact with them. They're nothing new, but they are very technical. And that's where a lot of the trouble starts, in my opinion, is that because they're so technical, some non-technical people just don't truly understand them. They don't recognize the value there. They don't champion them. They don't see them as a way of delivering the value and the services they want to do. But they really should, in my opinion. The result of this is that we end up with some really narrow-sighted digital transformation, in my view. So APIs tend to end up being driven as a technical requirement rather than recognizing them as something broader, something more strategic, and thereby unlocking a whole heap of value that could be there if we do it more than just seeing them as a point-to-point connection between digital systems. but it's also due to these unquestioned assumptions that often are embedded in systems where we just say, well, we need to do this for people. You know, I'm making that point about setting humans aside. This digital transformation, people don't consume APIs. So why would we build the API? Why should we care about that, right? Set aside that mindset. It really hampers what you can achieve if you stay rooted in that, in my view anyway. You know, the point is that there are different strengths to the different players you might have in any system or process these days. You know, humans, we're great, right? Let's not forget that, but we're really slow and fallible, certainly compared to machines. You know, APIs, these machines, they can stream real-time information with this sort of a precision and an accuracy at scales that we as humans can't process. You know, they can execute actions at rates faster than humans can react to, and they do that without tiring. You know, they allow us as humans, when done right, we can shift from having to sort of actively seek through information to find if there's something that may be relevant to us, to sitting back passively and reacting when something relevant is brought to our attention. And we shouldn't fear or fight those kinds of capabilities, right? We shouldn't ignore them and dismiss them because we don't kind of understand them. And what we don't understand is a bit scary. What we should do is try and learn more about them and understand them better. And to my mind, if we want to do digital transformation right, if we want to create digital services, we need to recognize and embrace these respective superpowers of humans and machines and play both to their strengths. Now, fortunately, I know I'm probably preaching to some of the converted here because we're seeing more of this in the public sector, right? Here's some of the flagship services that are out there under the government as a platform umbrella, and these are effectively APIs. Great. You know, it's got logic. We're actually engaged with Scottish Government building out their payments platform. And again, that's very much API focused. There are other elements to it as well, but that gives it a scalability and a breadth of potential that it wouldn't if we just talked about this being a user interface. Now, we're also engaged with the DWP, and I had the joy recently of chairing a panel where Jackie Legerter from the DWP recounted a story about some of their recent API work and one of their successes. And this is all in COVID. In COVID lockdown, they exposed an API for the NHS. Now, you might be aware that when it comes to prescriptions in the NHS, there are certain people who are entitled to receive prescriptions for free because of certain benefits claims. Now, that is a hugely arduous process to do all that checking. And at the point of sale, as I probably shouldn't call it, but at the point of collecting that prescription, there's no mechanism, or there wasn't a mechanism for that check to be done about whether this person was entitled. So sometimes people were paying for prescriptions they shouldn't have to pay for. Sometimes people were not paying for prescriptions they shouldn't pay for. And there's a huge cost and effort involved with that. Now, the DWP has exposed an API to NHS to be able to check that in real time. So there's a quick identity piece. Check in there, is this person entitled to a free prescription effectively? DWP answer is yes or no in the blink of an eye. Now, they reckon this is potentially saving 200 to 250 million pounds by having this little digital interface that pretty much just responds with a Boolean flag of true or false. And that's phenomenal. That's something that humans can't do at that pace and that speed and that accuracy. Now, I could go on about APIs in detail and what good looks like and all of that kind of stuff for a lot more, but I wrote a white paper about that, and I'm not here to talk about that white paper. So this is the link. It was plugged earlier. We'll give you an option to request it at the end of the talk as well, but that'll tell you more about what APIs are and what good looks like, and it's all in a very non-technical way, pretty much like I'm talking now. But I want to get back to this government as a platform thing. Tim O'Reilly, in his positioning of government as a platform, talks about being an enabler, and he talks about fostering innovation, but he talks about doing that inside and outside government. Right? He asks this question about how government can become an open platform for all to innovate. Now, if you look at what's out there on blogs from the GDS and elsewhere, it don't quite speak to that, right? It says here, Government as a platform was created in order to solve the most frequent challenges across the public sector. Okay, by addressing these issues once and creating common commodity-like components that can be used across the public sector, service teams can get to building their services quicker than ever. Yes and no. If we look at those examples I brought up earlier, I've highlighted the bit that caused me a bit of frustration, and it says, you know, if you work in the public sector, if you're in the public sector, if you're in the public sector. As someone who's not in the public sector, it feels like I'm locked out of some of this, and I don't quite understand why. I'm sure there's good reasons. But that DWP example, right, that is a point-to-point API they've created with the NHS. So if I had this amazing service I wanted to bring to our citizens, I wouldn't even know of the existence of this API if I hadn't attended one of these talks, for example. But other departments don't know about this. So, you know, across the board, not only to those outside of government, but inside government and across government, we're throwing up this wall once again. We're saying these, just go away, do your own thing, stay in your own little silo, don't talk to us. And that is not the way we can really start to create government as a platform, in my opinion. It doesn't speak to the true value there. Now, I'm not the first person to argue this at all, right? There's many others who have also argued that potentially those examples are about building a platform for government rather than government as a platform. And again, I'm not going to get sidetracked by that. But what I am going to do is ask you to do this. I'm ask you to open up, start to advertise what you're doing, put it out there. And a lot of people are scared because of the security or the technicalities of these things. Please don't be. And I'm going to try and reassure you with some examples of how this can be done. And at least, even if you can present a sense of openness, even if you aren't fully open, it creates a dialogue in a way that it doesn't if you don't put this door in the wall, frankly. Now, here, this is Transport for London. I think they're a fantastic example of opening up. Back in 2010, they started making all their non-personal information publicly available. So there's an API. I can go and find out about train statuses. I can go and find out about any information I want, basically, that is not personal, that they own. And they started to make that available because they wanted to effectively enable partners to produce new services, new products, and get them to market faster than TfL could, but also to create those services that TfL couldn't imagine, didn't want to imagine, didn't want to own, didn't want to operate, but they didn't want to block anyone. They wanted to be open about this. And Deloitte, back in 2017, did a review of this in terms of economic and social value, and they reckoned that it's annually about 130 million pounds worth of economic benefits and savings for travellers, London, and TfL created by these open APIs. And yes, I say they ducked some of the harder stuff because they went for the non-personal, but they're not. The harder stuff is perfectly achievable. This is the point around platforms. Now, those of you who aren't familiar with Ben Thompson, he's a wonderful author and speaker about technology and strategy, and he's very US focused, and he doesn't really go near the public sector stuff at all. But he does have a lot of theory around what he calls aggregators versus platforms. And one of the differentiators that he always calls out about platforms as a concept is how powerful they are because of this relationship they create between third parties and end users. You talk about Windows as a platform. Windows created a bunch of APIs, and it allowed anyone to build applications that they could sell to end users of Windows. That was the true value. That is what is half the success of iPhones these days, or originally an Android. They're there as a platform. They get you going, and yes, they provide some of those services, but they also let others have a direct relationship with you. They don't control that in quite the same way that others might. And let's be clear here, we are expecting other people to open up, right? We as a government are making this happen elsewhere. Now, not to public sector, we're doing this to private sector, but I would argue that that banking is a public service. It's just provided by the private sector. Now, this open banking initiative, if you aren't familiar with it, came in January 2018, and the Competition and Markets Authority introduced it as a sort of a regulatory driver to have more user-centered competition and innovation in the market. And effectively, it requires banks to make customers' information available to regulated third-party providers through prescribed and standardized APIs. So this is incredibly sensitive information that the banks have to make available. We've been working with NatWest Group on their open banking portals for several years now, and it's a huge undertaking for the bank, but it's incredible how much value it is unlocking outside of the bank, but also even within the bank. Within the bank, they're now using their own open banking APIs more than they are anything else, because it gives them a beautiful, clean platform to work on. In fact, it's driving them to do more. They have now requests coming in from big and small third parties saying, well, we'd love to work, we'd love to engage with you, but you don't quite have this in your API. Was that something you could add in there? Because they've got a website, Bank of APIs, and that website tells you all that's currently available, and then says, and if you want to get in touch because something's not here, come and speak here. That's that door opening in that wall. That's just advertising that they want to be out there and engaging with people, which we don't typically do in public sector. And this is the sort of a fascinating point that it gets to, is around open standards, right? The open banking there is an open standard. Anyone can go and look at the definition of this. And that's the key. This is an aspect of APIs that to me is too often overlooked, right? APIs are ultimately just definitions. They aren't implementations. And that allows us to avoid a lot of the nasty, frankly. We don't have to worry about exactly how we're going to do this, at least it's not this point in time. We can start to look at just, okay, well, how do we have this digitized conversation with third parties? How do you want to regulate this? But this can be imposed, this can be introduced by regulators, or it can be devised by yourself. And if we look at the internet, this is how the internet established and evolved, right? It didn't say this is absolutely how everything has to be implemented. It described protocols, it described APIs. It's created entire bodies that are focused on developing and iterating and improving those open standards. It's phenomenal to see how they organize themselves and how somehow in a world where you've got Microsoft and Google and Amazon and Facebook, and they're all at war to try and own everything, how we've managed to land on a space where actually browsers are largely homogeneous in terms of their APIs. They're starting to become almost operating system level complexity that lives there in that browser, and it's phenomenal. And that's not dictated upon any of them. Strongly encouraged, and it's what makes that infrastructure work. You can go and study how they set up all their working groups and how they reach decisions around those open standards to see how that can evolve and be this huge place for participation by experts from all sorts of different areas. It's fascinating. So really what we need to do is we need to start asking ourselves, okay, what are our public services? This is an interesting point to start from. So I mentioned banking there. Banking a public service? I would argue it is. Is energy? Yes, I would say it is. We can look around and you can start to wonder, okay, when we talk about public service, too often we end up in this debate about, well, is it private sector that's the provider, or is it the public sector that's the provider? Who's the provider, and therefore is it a public service? Let's forget that, right? Let's ignore that politics. I think we could probably all agree that these services, their existence and how they might operate to an extent is something that is a public service, and it should be regulated and managed by the government. That's why we have the regulators there in the first place. And if they push some of this openness into those areas, and I think we should do that into our public sector bodies as well, then actually we can start to create this platform. We can start to, frankly, not care if a service is provided by the public sector or the private sector. It can be provided by either or both. And as citizens, we will get the best out of that because we can, frankly, we can vote with our feet. And this is something that actually Tim O'Reilly called out back in those early, in his government as a platform piece as well, right? but we have developed so much further. We have so many more examples now. And the reason I keep harking on about that open banking is because I can't see many situations where there aren't examples of how we can get started in all sorts of sensitive areas in that open banking initiative, right? They've regulated who the parties are that can actually interact with those APIs, but the APIs are open. So if you're in a startup somewhere, you can start to build your idea. You can see a viable roadmap for what you might do, part of which will be, okay, I need to go and get approval to play in this space. But you can already start doing some of the technical work and start to do some proof of concept in sandboxes, in safe places, and that will foster innovation and let you explore things. Now, I had a look with this sort of mindset at my local council's website. I thought, well, if I was looking at local government, because it's too easy to just look at central government, and there's lots of things that should be centralized, but local government, that's not so centralized. What are some of the things here that maybe warrant open standards? And I'm going to pick a controversial or not controversial, depending on your point of view, one and say bins, right? Bin collection day. Nearly every council website you go onto, the equivalent of that check your bin day question is fairly high up there. It's certainly one of the main reasons I use that website. Now, suppose we created an open standard for checking bin collection in any area and said to every local council, right, you need to provide an implementation of this API. Now, that's a very tall ask, right? And I wouldn't say we do this overnight and we suddenly force it on all of them, but it would foster some really interesting innovation. It would create opportunities, and not just opportunities on the consuming side of that API, but also on the producer side of that API. Now, suddenly, there might be private sector providers who go, well, hang on, creating the system that does this for all of local government across the country. Now, that's a potential value I want to chase. Whereas currently, if they did that, it's like, oh, well, I need to do a version for this council over here and a version for that council over there and a version for that council over there. And that's a lot of headache. I best not bother. So it opens up a marketplace and space for fostering innovation on that side of the API, but also on the other side. Right now, if I'm a third party and I've got some service to which, well, I'm trying to think off the top of my head what a service would want to feed in bin collection day. I'll go with Google Maps because Google Maps seems to want to consume every information that's out there and include it. But suppose you're Google there. Suddenly now I could go onto Google Maps and I could see my bin collection day, maybe. Now that's maybe not obviously valuable to me, but it might be valuable to others. It might be sensible to others. I mean, I mentioned that Transport for London data earlier. That's integrated into Google Maps, and that's why I find that very valuable, because now I can find my way around London by using Google Maps rather than having to find 5 or 6 different apps that tell me different bits of information. So it does create real opportunities around that. And that's the conversation I really think we need to start having. But I'm kind of getting down to nitty gritty. I'm talking about bin collection. I want to just zoom out for a second here and put this into a wider context. And this is something, I think, slightly more philosophical that I've been deliberating. You might have come across the concept before that we have been democratizing knowledge over the last centuries, frankly. You know, it started from a position where everyone was illiterate, except for the select few, and the access to knowledge was very limited and was not available to those except for those with special means. And then things like the printing press came along, and that suddenly, you know, dispersed knowledge wider. And then libraries started to be able to accumulate those books that were pressed, and literacy started to improve, and knowledge became more and more available. And then the internet came along, and poof, you know, now nominally anyone anywhere in the world can access knowledge, can share knowledge, which is phenomenal. It has created a drastic change in our society. But I think we're actually on the cusp of something similar when we talk about services. I think a lot of the points touched on actually go further. We're at a point where with the internet and with artificial intelligence and the hyperconnectivity, cloud making compute available everywhere, APIs and everything, we're at a point where we might actually be able to make services available to everyone. And we shouldn't make them available to only those who can afford it or who happen to live in the right place. There's an opportunity to shape some of this so that they are genuinely accessible to all, regardless of digital literacy, accessibility needs, anything. You know, it's phenomenal what we could do here. And that's what I wanted to emphasize through this talk, right? I want to say this point, right? We need to start from a position when we're talking in public sector. We need to start enabling rather than controlling what's happening out there. We need to let machines talk to machines. We need to create these APIs to connect these things up, but we need to do that in an open way, not a closed way, not a point-to-point, not a technical way. Let's be out there. Let's get the literacy and the understanding around these APIs up there. And then that last point I was making was about how we can separate definition from implementation. We can think about APIs as this abstract concept that they are, and not worry about who, where, and how that is actually turned into a reality that will follow. And that's how I think, and that's why I think APIs are really the key to making government as a platform a reality. So thank you. And with that, I will hand back over to Claire.